What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a lore video about none other than Braccus Rex, the Source King, the Tyrant, the Mad King in some cases. So, more than likely, if I had to guess, you've probably heard about Braccus Rex from Divinity Original Sin 2. Now that said, Braccus Rex actually isn't in that many Divinity games. So there were several Divinity games before the Original Sin series came out, and Braccus Rex was made for the Original Sin series. He's actually not mentioned before the original Divinity Original Sin. And Divinity Original Sin takes place in 4 AD. Braccus Rex was a benevolent king at one point in a period sometime between roughly 8800 AR and a few thousand years before 4 AD. We're not 100% on the time. They're vague about it. There's nothing that tells us exactly when this happened. But Braccus Rex was a benevolent king at one point who then discovered source magic and almost immediately descended into madness over it, and thus began his reign of absolutely terrible acts, maiming people, cursing them, all the craziness that you hear about in the first act of Divinity Original Sin 2, which again is probably why you're watching this video. Now, because of all these acts and, people in general that were under his rule not appreciating this, the Order of the Source Hunters was founded, and its first mission was to fight Braccus Rex. They eventually were able to capture him on his island and seemingly seat of power, Fort Joy, where they then brought him back to the mainland, where he was tried, executed, thrown into a well, where he was eventually recovered by the Church of the Seven, and then at that point actually given a proper burial. Now, before we go any further, there are going to be spoilers for Divinity Original Sin and Divinity Original Sin 2 in this video. So if you don't want those spoilers, maybe save this video for another time. But in order to tell you about Braccus Rex and the lore behind the guy, I do have to make some spoilers for both of those games. Now let's start with the game that Braccus Rex was originally mentioned in. In Divinity Original Sin 1, Braccus was resurrected by the Immaculate cult, specifically a mage healer guy sort, whose name was Thelrion. Now, Braccus Rex was resurrected because of his knowledge of soul forging, which is binding one person's soul to another person's soul. Now, what that means long term is that basically if one of the people soul forged dies, so does the other one. It connects two people physically to the point where, their life force is basically connected through their souls being intertwined. Now, Braccus Rex had this knowledge because he was actually soul forged to his twin sister, Cassandra. Now, that said, while they were able to glean some information from Braccus Rex, they were ultimately, the Cult of the Immaculates that is, unable to control him because of his immense power in channeling the power of Source. So at this point, Braccus Rex goes rogue, starts resurrecting other undead minions to help him fight, but is ultimately cut down by the Source Hunter protagonists of Divinity Original Sin. Braccus Rex serves as sort of the last boss of Act 1 if you're following the story completely. Though to be clear, he is optional, you don't actually have to kill him at all. But canonically, that's what happens, is that he dies. Now, that is not actually, however, the end of things in Divinity Original Sin just yet, because we actually can meet his twin sister, Cassandra. Braccus Rex, being the terrible tyrant king that he is, obviously couldn't stand being soul forged to someone who could die, thus being his greatest weakness. So what Braccus Rex did was tortured his sister and eventually wound up turning her into a lich, and her immortal undead status ultimately freed Braccus Rex of his weakness of being attached to her. A bit unrelated, but coincidentally, during the events where Cassandra was being tortured and kept captive by Braccus Rex, she actually befriended a cat that she then gave sentience beyond what a cat would normally have, and that cat eventually became Arhu the Wizard. Because in case you weren't aware, there's some extra lore for you. Arhu was actually originally the cat of Cassandra, Braccus Rex's sister. And through the powers of source magic herself, she gave him more life than what a cat would normally have. And that's how Arhu became the man-cat shifting wizard that he is in the later games. Now, for Divinity Original Sin 1, that's pretty much all there is. There's not a ton going on with Braccus besides that. He's not like a major character outside of the events of Act 1 and kind of leaning into the rest of the story. Now that brings us to Divinity Original Sin 2, where the first act of the game takes place on none other than the island of Fort Joy, Braccus Rex's old seat of power and seemingly experimental playground. Now, it is here on this island stronghold of sorts that he had going on that he created multiple source weapons using his mastery over source. These include the Source Callers, the purging wands we find, which purge Source from other sorcerers and give them to Braccus Rex, as well as the Shriekers, which are very similar to a crucifixion in the real world, where basically Braccus Rex will hang a person up on like a stake or a cross or whatever, and then through some magical process, they devolve into mindless beasts who don't seem to need anything, and they are basically raw Source, and anything that comes near them, they blast to death with impossible amounts of Source. Now, the only way to kill a Shrieker is, ironically enough, to use something like a Purging Wand or similar ability that purges the Source from their bodies, and thus finally is able to kill the Shrieker. Now, in addition to these weapons, on Braccus Rex's island here, we run into all of the terrible things Braccus Rex has done to people, which includes cursing people, maiming them, and outright killing them. So, again, the island is littered with this stuff. There's honestly just too many to mention. But it seems that what Braccus Rex particularly enjoyed doing is cursing people into service. So basically, Braccus Rex was actually this really charismatic guy, even for the Tyrant King that he was. And he would lure people in on promises of wealth and power, and eventually he would use that to get at them and take advantage of their soul, and usually trap it in a jar of some sort. And then once he had that, he would basically force them to do whatever he wanted, because they were cursed, and without their soul, they would basically live until they were nothing but bones, becoming undead, because without their soul jar, there was no real dying for them. Braccus Rex did this to a lot of people. He did this to Trompdoy, the bard of sorts that he uses to guard his treasury on the island. He did this to Gratiana, his eventually redeemed concubine, who raised villages and gave him Source powers from these dead villagers that she purged them from, and just in general enabled a lot of his more ruthless methods. So eventually Gratiana herself, by the way, repented for all the things she'd done and actually genuinely devoted herself to the goddess Amadia. But you can also find her soul jar on the island. There are countless wizards and seers and stuff around the island as well that you can encounter that are undead who are still serving Braccus Rex in death. And if you get them to go against their curses, some of them will even die outright for violating the curse. It's interesting that his magic and these curses actually had such long-lasting effects, to the point that even though he is long gone for thousands of years, because Divinity Original Sin 2 takes place in 1242 AD as opposed to 4 AD for the first game, even then, when Braccus Rex has died twice, literally, so far already, his magic still continues. But one of my personal favorite things that Braccus Rex did is you can find a ton of fire slugs down in the prison area of the Fort Joy proper. If you actually have the Pet Pal perk and speak to these fire slugs, which that perk will let you do, you find out that their leader, the queen, was actually supposed to marry Braccus Rex, but he got so annoyed with her that he turned her and her entire entourage into fire slugs, which I honestly thought was hilarious. So Act 1 of Divinity Original Sin, Divinity Original Sin 2, you hear all about these terrible things Braccus done. It really builds him up in the background as this awful character who controlled people through source magic. It's a lot of information about who he was and the type of person he was, but that's it. Then you leave the island and continue on. And you don't hear any more about him until the very end of the game. And this part is probably the biggest of all the spoilers that I mentioned earlier. As it turns out, a man you met on the Lady Vengeance as you leave Fort Joy named Tarquin was actually forced to resurrect Braccus Rex again by none other than Dallas, an Eternal, who was actually posing as someone called Dallas, but that's a whole thing and not super relevant to what we're talking about here. But basically, Tarquin was forced to resurrect Braccus Rex. Braccus Rex was then actually forced to help Dallas, as well as Lucian, the Divine, who it turns out was not actually dead. But those two were actually strong enough, as opposed to the Immaculate cult, who were not strong enough to control Braccus Rex. However, while Lucian and Dallas were able to successfully control Braccus Rex for a while, they couldn't contain him forever. And as you confront Dallas and Lucian at the end of the game, Braccus Rex, no matter how this plays out, actually manages to finally slip his bonds and becomes essentially more or less the last boss of the game. And then you have to kill Braccus Rex to end the last fight, because Braccus Rex had actually sworn himself to an entity known as the God King, which I might make a separate video about. There's a lot going on there. But suffice to say, killing Braccus Rex then essentially ends the game. And there you go, guys. That is actually pretty much everything about one of the single most interesting characters in the Divinity series, Braccus Rex. Not quite as much as people might imagine, but there is absolutely everything I could gather. If there's anything you feel I missed, feel free to leave it down in the comments section below. I'll be more than happy to read it. I do read basically every comment I get, even if I don't always reply. With that in mind, if you enjoyed the video, I certainly hope you like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. As it stands, about 95% of my audience typically isn't subscribed, and if people would subscribe, I could actually start doing this professionally, which would be tremendous for me personally, of course. I'll keep you no further. Thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.